Klaus Fuchs handed his first bundle of documents to a Soviet contact in a Birmingham pub car park in the summer of 1941. And for the next 8 years, the German-born physicist would remain the single most productive scientific source. The GRU and later the MGB ran inside the British atomic program. He was arrested at Harwell on February 2, 1950, by William Scarden of MI5, a former Metropolitan Police detective who conducted the interrogations in a small office overlooking the Berkshire countryside. Fuchs confessed after 4 sessions. He had passed the implosion lens design, the plutonium critical mass figures, and the tritium boosting concept, the entire architecture of the Nagasaki weapon, and the outline of the hydrogen bomb that would follow. The jet story sat one desk over in the same Whitehall filing system, and it wounded the British establishment more deeply because it was not stolen. It was sold. On September 14, 1946, Sir Stafford Cripps, president of the Board of Trade in Attlee's government, signed off on the export of 25 Rolls-Royce Nene centrifugal flow turbojets to the Soviet Union, followed by 30 Rolls-Royce Derwents. The engines went with technical drawings, metallurgical specifications, and permission to manufacture under license. Cripps had been warned. The Chiefs of Staff Committee, chaired by Field Marshal Lord Allenbrook's successor, Lord Tedder, had objected in writing. The Air Ministry objected. The Ministry of Supply objected. Cripps pressed on, arguing that the Soviets were still nominal allies, that the engines contained no atomic secrets, and that Britain desperately needed the hard currency and the goodwill. Ernest Bevin, Foreign Secretary, was in Paris at the peace conference and did not intervene. Attlee, briefed after the fact, declined to reverse the decision. The engines were crated at Derby and shipped through Hull. Stalin, when the offer first reached Moscow, is reported by V.M. Klimov's post-war memoir to have said something close to, "What fool would sell us his secrets?" The fool in this case was a Labour cabinet trying to earn dollars. The Nene was the finest jet engine in the world in 1946. Frank Whittle's centrifugal flow design, refined by Rolls-Royce chief engineer Stanley Hooker, produced 5,000 pounds of thrust, more than any American or Soviet power plant then flying. The Soviets did not merely copy it. They reverse-engineered it, tested it to destruction at the Central Institute of Aviation Motors outside Moscow, and had it in serial production as the Klimov RD-45 by the end of 1947, 15 months from delivery to factory floor. The airframe designers at OKB-155, headed by Artem Mikoyan and Mikhail Gurevich, had been waiting for exactly this engine. They bolted it into a swept-wing prototype that first flew on December 30th, 1947. 9 months later, it entered production as the MiG-15. Rolls-Royce received no royalties. The licensing agreement was ignored the moment the crates were opened. By November 1950, over the Yalu River, MiG-15s were shooting down American B-29s and outturning F-80S and F-84s at altitude. The RAF's Fighter Command, watching the intelligence traffic from Korea come through the Joint Intelligence Committee, realized what had been given away. Sir John Slessor, Chief of the Air Staff from January 1950, wrote privately that the Nene decision was the worst single act of self-inflicted damage in British aviation history. The MiG-15 would be built in greater numbers than any jet fighter before or since, more than 18,000 airframes across Soviet, Polish, Czechoslovak, and Chinese production. Every one of them, at its heart, carried a machine descendant of a Derby-built engine. And by 1948, the men who had sold it were already trying to work out how to get it back. The recovery effort, such as it was, began in the Ministry of Supply on a wet March morning in 1948 when George Strauss, the minister, asked his officials whether any legal remedy remained. The answer, drafted by the department's chief legal advisor and copied to the Foreign Office, ran to 4 pages and concluded that none did. The Soviets had signed the license, paid the initial fee of £96,000, and were now under no obligation to submit production figures, share improvements, or pay royalties on airframes rather than engines. Rolls-Royce had been outmaneuvered by a clause its own lawyers had drafted. Sir Archibald Rowlands, permanent secretary at Supply, minuted that the ministry would in future require the chiefs of staff to countersign any military export to the Soviet bloc. The minute was filed. Within 18 months, the Berlin blockade had ended the question by making further sales politically impossible. But the horse, as one Air Ministry official put it in a memorandum, now held at Kew under AVEA 65/1043, had bolted with the stable. The Joint Intelligence Committee, chaired at that point by William Hayter of the Foreign Office, began in the summer of 1948 to receive fragmentary reports on Soviet jet production from a network of sources in the British zone of Germany. Former Luftwaffe engineers who had worked at Junkers and BMW were being repatriated from Kuibyshev and Podberezhye, where they had spent 3 years under NKVD supervision, helping the Soviets absorb German turbojet technology. Their debriefings, conducted at a discreet house in Bad Salzuflen by officers of the Intelligence Division of the Control Commission for Germany, produced the first solid Western estimates of Soviet jet manufacturing capacity. Colonel Terence Airy, who ran the operation, sent a summary to London in October 1948, estimating that the Soviets would have between 600 and 1,000 first-line jet fighters within 18 months. The figure was low. By June 1950, when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, the Soviet air forces held over 2,500 MiG-15 SS or MiG-15 variants in operational units, with production running at roughly 40 airframes per week at Kuibyshev alone. MI6, then still transitioning under Sir Stuart Menzies from wartime working practices, ran a parallel effort through its Vienna and Berlin stations. The single most valuable early source was not a spy but a defector, Lieutenant Anatoly Barsov of the Soviet Air Force, who flew a MiG-15 to the American zone of Korea on September 21, 1953. British test pilots from Boscombe Down were invited by the Americans to examine the aircraft at Kadena Air Base, Okinawa. The technical report, written by Squadron Leader Peter Thorne and circulated to the Air Ministry in December 1953, confirmed what everyone already suspected. The engine was a Nini, the metallurgy was slightly inferior. The airframe was better than anything the RAF had flown against it. Thorne's report ended with a paragraph that would define British air planning for the rest of the decade. The MiG-15 was not the ceiling of Soviet capability. It was the floor. The problem, as Sir William Elliott at the Joint Planning Staff put it to Attlee in a Cabinet Defence Committee paper of February 1951, was that the MiG-15's successor was already flying. Photographs taken by an RAF Meteor PR.10 from Wan Airfield in the British zone and by the CIA's early overflight program showed swept-wing prototypes at Ramenskoye that would enter service as the MiG-17 in October 1952. Britain had given the Soviets a lead they had not earned. Now Whitehall needed to work out what else they might steal, and from whom. The Portland spy ring was worked by MI5's D branch for 11 months before the arrests on January 7, 1961, and the case files, released in 2002 under the 30-year rule, show the operation had been running against the Admiralty Underwater Weapons Establishment for at least 7 years. Harry Houghton, a former Royal Navy petty officer turned filing clerk, had been passing details of Britain's first nuclear submarine sonar program to a Polish intelligence officer since 1953. His girlfriend Ethel G., who worked in the drawing office at the establishment, had access to the fluid dynamics data on the dreadnought hull. Their controller, calling himself Gordon Lonsdale, was in fact Konon Trofimovich Molody, a Soviet illegal born in Moscow in 1922, raised partly in California, and inserted into Britain in March 1955 on a forged Canadian passport in the name of a dead child from Kirkland Lake, Ontario. Molody was arrested in a Waterloo Road doorway carrying a shopping bag that contained undeveloped microfilm of a Portland document classified confidential and a set of one-time pads. He was tried at the Old Bailey in March 1961 before Lord Chief Justice Parker and sentenced to 25 years. He served 3 before being exchanged at the Heerstrasse checkpoint on April 22, 1964, for the British businessman Greville Wynne, who had run Oleg Penkovsky. The pattern was not new. What the Portland case forced Whitehall to confront was that the theft of British technology had never stopped in 1946 with the jet engines. It had industrialized. Sir Roger Hollis, Director General of MI5, commissioned in the aftermath of the arrests an internal review of Soviet technical intelligence operations against British defense contractors from 1945 onwards. The review, conducted by a small team under Anthony Simpkins, drew on Venona decrypts shared by GCHQ, on interviews with former SIS officers, and on the debriefings of a handful of Soviet defectors, chief among them Vladimir Petrov, who had walked into the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation office in Canberra in April 1954. Petrov's testimony, forwarded to London through liaison channels, listed by name 6 British scientists and engineers whom the MGB had cultivated or attempted to cultivate between 1946 and 1953. Only 2 had been prosecuted. The rest had either died, retired, or been quietly removed from sensitive work without ever facing court because the evidence Petrov offered would not survive cross-examination. Simpkins concluded that Soviet technical intelligence in Britain had focused on 3 areas in the late 1940s and early 1950s: jet propulsion, nuclear weapons design, and radar. In each, the losses had been catastrophic. The Nene sale had opened the door. Fuchs had walked through it, and a third figure, less famous than either, had done more damage in the radar field than has ever been publicly acknowledged. His name was Engelbert Broda. He was an Austrian physicist who had worked at the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge from 1941 to 1947, cleared by MI5 despite active Communist Party membership, and identified only in the 1990s from Venona traffic as the Soviet source codenamed Eric. Broda had passed details of British centimetric radar, of the Manhattan Project via his access to Bruno Pontecorvo, and, critically, of the early British work on airborne interception radar that would eventually equip the Gloucester Javelin. Simpkins' review remained classified until 2014. Its central finding was blunt. Britain had bled technology for 15 years and the surgeons had been asleep. The V-bombers were the British answer, and they were designed under the assumption that everything about them would eventually be known to the Soviets. Air Chief Marshal Sir John Baker at the Air Ministry in 1946 drafted the operational requirement for a jet bomber capable of delivering a 10,000-pound atomic weapon over 3,350 nautical miles at 500 knots and 50,000 feet. 3 specifications were issued: B.35/46 to A.V. Rowe, B.35/46 to Handley Page, and B.14/46 to Vickers as an insurance design. The result was the Vulcan, the Victor, and the Valiant. The Valiant flew first on May 18, 1951, from Wisley in Surrey, with George Edwards' chief test pilot, Joseph Mutt Summers, at the controls. It was a conservative design, straight of purpose. The Vulcan and Victor were something else entirely. Roy Chadwick, the Avro designer who had produced the Lancaster, was killed in the Tudor II crash at Woodford on August 23, 1947, before the Vulcan flew, and the design was completed by Stuart Davies. The prototype VX770 lifted off from Woodford on August 30, 1952, with Roland Falk at the controls. Falk had flown it in a business suit. The Delta Wing, the 4 Bristol Olympus engines buried in the wing roots, the enormous internal weapons bay, every element pushed British aerospace to a limit it had not previously reached. Handley Page's Victor, designed by Reginald Stafford under Sir Frederick Handley, Page's supervision flew on December 24, 1952, from Boscombe Down. Its crescent wing was, in the judgment of most historians, the most advanced aerodynamic concept flying anywhere in the world in that year. The three bombers between them would carry Britain's nuclear deterrent from 1955 until the Royal Navy took over the strategic role with Polaris in 1969. The intelligence assumption throughout the V-bomber development was that every technical detail would leak. It was not paranoia. On September 27, 1949, Donald Maclean, then head of the American department at the Foreign Office, had been recalled from Washington after a nervous breakdown. He would defect to Moscow with Guy Burgess on May 25, 1951. Kim Philby, the head of SIS liaison in Washington, was recalled the following month under a cloud that would not lift until his own defection from Beirut on January 23, 1963. The full extent of the Cambridge network was not yet known, but the Joint Intelligence Committee had by 1952 begun to work on the assumption that classified defense information circulating in London might be in Moscow within a fortnight. This shaped the V-Force in specific ways. The Blue Danube atomic bomb, Britain's first operational nuclear weapon, entered service in November 1953 with a design deliberately compartmented so that no single scientist at Aldermaston held the complete blueprint. Sir William Penny, who had witnessed the Nagasaki attack and directed the hurricane test at the Montebello Islands on October 3, 1952, insisted on the arrangement personally. The V-bombers themselves were dispersed across 36 airfields under the Bomber Command Dispersal Scheme drawn up by Air Marshal Sir Harry Broadhurst in 1958. A 4-minute readiness state was maintained. Aircrew slept in their flight suits. By the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, Bomber Command could put 144 V-bombers in the air within 15 minutes. Every one of them, in theory, could reach Moscow. The theory had a hole in it, and its name was Oleg Penkovsky. Penkovsky first approached the Americans in Moscow on August 12, 1960, by handing a package to 2 American tourists in Red Square, asking them to deliver it to the US Embassy. The CIA declined for 6 months to work him, believing the approach might be a provocation. In April 1961, he made contact instead through Greville Wynne, a British businessman travelling in Moscow on trade delegation business, and MI6 took the case. Sir Dick White C. from 1956 personally authorised the running of Penkovsky as a joint operation with the CIA. The first time SIS and CIA had shared an agent of that seniority at that stage of the Cold War. Penkovsky was a colonel in the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, attached ostensibly to the State Committee for the Coordination of Scientific Research. He had access to the Marshal Sergei Vorontsov Circle, to the Central Committee's science and technology apparatus, and, crucially for the events that were coming, to the manuals of the Soviet strategic rocket forces. The Penkovsky case was run from London by Harold Shergold, head of the SIS Soviet Bloc Controllerate, working with George Kiesewetter and Joe Bullock of the CIA. The debriefings took place in London hotel rooms during Penkovsky's trade delegation visits, and in Paris. Between April 1961 and August 1962, he produced 10,000 pages of technical material, including the complete field manual for the SS-4 Sandal medium-range ballistic missile, the same weapon the Soviets would install in Cuba. When U-2 photographs taken on October 14, 1962 showed missile sites under construction near San Cristobal, it was the Penkovsky material that allowed American analysts at the National Photographic Interpretation Center to identify the missiles as SS-4s and to establish that they were not yet operational. President Kennedy had, in effect, a stolen manual against which to measure the intelligence photographs. It was British recruitment that put it in his hands. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan learned of the missile sites on October 21, 1962, in a personal telegram from Kennedy delivered by Ambassador David Ormsby Gore to Admiralty House, where Macmillan was staying while 10 Downing Street was refurbished. Ormsby Gore was Kennedy's closest British friend. He would go on to influence the choice of quarantine over immediate airstrikes. Macmillan chaired the cabinet on October 22, 1962. His diary entry that evening recorded the mood as calm, but the RAF was already moving. Bomber Command's quick reaction alert was raised to the highest state short of nuclear release. Thor intermediate-range ballistic missiles at 60 sites across eastern England, RAF Feltwell, RAF Hemswell, RAF Driffield and their satellites, were brought to 15-minute readiness. Each Thor carried a 1.44 megaton W-49 warhead, targeted on Soviet cities. At GCHQ Cheltenham, additional Russian linguists were called in from the reserve. The Composite Signals Organization station at Cyprus increased coverage of Soviet Black Sea Fleet traffic. Naval Signals Intelligence from HMS Mercury tracked Soviet submarines in the Norwegian Sea. Penkovsky was arrested in Moscow on that same day, October 22, 1962. He had been under KGB surveillance since early September. The final signal he sent, 3 blank telephone calls meaning imminent Soviet nuclear attack, was received by his SIS handler, Janet Chisholm's replacement Rowry Chisholm, through a dead-drop signal at a lamppost on the Kutuzovsky Prospect. SIS did not act on the warning. They judged it a KGB provocation. Correctly, the Thor missiles came out of Britain in August 1963 under Skybolt-related arrangements agreed at Nassau, and their departure marked a strategic hinge. The V-bombers would carry the deterrent alone for the 6 years until Polaris and Whitehall was already working on how to preserve credibility once high-altitude penetration became impossible. Francis Gary Powers had been shot down over Sverdlovsk on May 1, 1960, by an SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missile, the same missile system the Soviets were exporting to Warsaw Pact air defenses and to North Vietnam. The Air Ministry had known since Powers' loss that the V-bombers, designed for 50,000-foot penetration, were now vulnerable at that altitude. The Blue Steel standoff missile, produced by Avro at Woodford and entering service in February 1963, extended the delivery range by 100 miles but was not a permanent answer. The permanent answer, chosen after considerable cabinet debate under Macmillan and continued under Sir Alec Douglas Home, was to shift the entire V-force to low-level penetration. From 1964, the Vulcans and Victors began training below 500 feet, terrain following at 350 knots, using ground clutter to defeat Soviet radar. The airframes were not designed for it. Vulcan wing spars cracked. Fatigue accumulated at rates that shortened service life by half. Aircrew flew training sorties over the Highlands and the Welsh mountains that killed at a rate of roughly 1 crew per year through the mid-1960s. The Royal Navy, meanwhile, was building the Resolution class. HMS Resolution, laid down at Vickers Armstrong's Barrow in Furness on February 26, 1964, was launched on September 15, 1966, and commissioned on October 2, 1967. The submarine was the first British platform to carry Polaris A-3 missiles, purchased from the United States under the Nassau Agreement of December 21, 1962. Each Resolution boat carried 16 missiles. Each missile carried 3 200-kiloton warheads, later replaced under the Chevaline program, with a British-designed penetration aid system. The Chevaline decision, taken under Harold Wilson's Labour government in 1974 and continued through Callaghan into Thatcher's first term, was one of the most closely held British defence secrets of the Cold War. The programme cost approximately £1 billion at 1980 prices, was never debated in Parliament during its development, and was designed to defeat the Soviet ABM-1 Galosh anti-ballistic missile system defending Moscow. The cabinet minutes recording its approval were withheld from all but a handful of ministers. Denis Healey, as Chancellor, was informed. Michael Foot, as leader of the House, was not. Continuous at-sea deterrence began with HMS Resolution's first patrol from Faslane on June 15, 1968. From that date until the end of the Cold War and beyond, at least one Royal Navy ballistic missile submarine has been at sea at any given moment. The patrol pattern was set by Vice Admiral Sir Hugh Mackenzie, the first Chief Polaris executive who had commanded the wartime submarine HMS Tantalus in the Far East. Patrols lasted between 60 and 90 days. The captain's targeting orders were sealed. The Prime Minister's letters of last resort, handwritten by every incoming PM from Wilson onwards and locked in a safe aboard each boat, remained unread. The Soviet Northern Fleet's response was to build the Victor III and Akula submarines, quiet enough to trail Resolution-class boats through the GIUK gap. GCHQ and its American partners at NSA developed the SOSUS underwater listening arrays across the Atlantic seabed to counter the threat. The intelligence war moved underwater and stayed there. Above the surface, the RAF was preparing for a different fight, one that would take place at 200 feet in the German plain. The British Army of the Rhine held its final positions along the Weser and the Leine, and the plans held at the Rheindahlen headquarters of Northern Army Group envisaged that if the Warsaw Pact came west, one British corps would hold for 72 hours before either releasing tactical nuclear weapons or being overrun. Corps strength in 1980 stood at approximately 55,000 troops, 4 armoured divisions on paper, but 3 in practice equipped with Chieftain main battle tanks that were reliable in defensive positions but slow in the counterattack. The Chieftain, produced by Vickers and by the Royal Ordnance Factory Leeds, had entered service in 1966 with the L11A 5 120mm rifled gun, the heaviest hitting tank gun in NATO. Its Leyland L60 engine was underpowered and unreliable. Crews cursed it. The follow-on Challenger 1, entering service in 1983, corrected the engine problem with the Rolls-Royce CV-12 diesel, but retained the rifled gun that had become a British peculiarity in an increasingly smoothbore world. The problem for Northern Army Group commanders, General Sir Frank Kitson, then General Sir Nigel Bagnall through the mid-1980s, was not equipment but frontage. The British sector ran from the Harz Mountains to the Elbe estuary. Against one British corps, the Soviets could bring the Third Shock Army from the group of Soviet forces Germany. 4 tank divisions, 1 motor rifle division, over 1,200 T-64 and T-80 tanks in the first echelon alone. The correlation of forces at the point of Soviet main effort was expected to reach 8-1. Bagnall, who took over as Commander Northern Army Group in 1983, tore up the linear forward defence plan. His concept, which came to be called the Bagnall Reforms and was adopted by Sir Martin Farndale as his successor, envisaged a manoeuvrist counterstroke by 1st Armoured Division against the Soviet second echelon as it crossed the inner German border. It required tactical nuclear release authority. It required air superiority the Royal Air Force could not guarantee. The RAF Germany component, commanded from Rheindahlen, held 4 Tornado GR-1 squadrons, 2 Harrier squadrons, and 2 Phantom Air Defence squadrons by 1985. Tornado, entering service in 1982 after the collaborative Panavia project with West Germany and Italy, was designed specifically for low-level penetration of Warsaw Pact airspace using terrain-following radar. Its primary weapon for the counter-airfield mission was the JP-233 runway denial submunition dispenser, a British-designed weapon that scattered 30 concrete-piercing bomblets and 215 minlets across a target airfield in a single pass. The intelligence picture that underpinned all this planning came from GCHQ's Composite Signals Organization, from the Brixmes liaison mission in Potsdam that ran regular tours through Soviet training areas in East Germany, and from a network of human sources whose product was distributed at the highest classifications inside Whitehall. Brixmes deserves particular note. Founded in 1946 under the Robertson-Malinin Agreement, the British Commanders-in-Chief mission to the Soviet forces in Germany operated 31 officers and men out of a villa at 27 Seestrasse in West Berlin, running tours in unmarked Opel Senator saloons across the Soviet zone. They photographed T-80 tanks at Magdeburg training areas, retrieved fragments of Su-27 fighter avionics from crash sites, and once in 1966 made off with a complete Yak-28 Firebar radar from a lake near Havelsey before Soviet divers arrived. Every fragment was analysed at the Defence Intelligence Staff in Whitehall. The tanks Britain planned to fight were, by 1985, better than the tanks Britain fielded. Oleg Gordievsky was extracted from Moscow on July 19, 1985, in the boot of a Ford Sierra, driven by an SIS officer's wife, across the Finnish border at Vinicula. He had been the KGB station chief designate in London, run by SIS as the agent codenamed Ovation since 1974, and his product had reached Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher personally through Sir Percy Craddock, the chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee. Gordievsky's warnings during the Able Archer exercise of November 1983, that the Soviet Politburo genuinely feared a NATO first strike, had reshaped Thatcher's approach to Mikhail Gorbachev when he visited Chequers on December 16, 1984. She had said afterwards that she could do business with him. She had been briefed by Gordievsky to say something close to it. The SIS extraction, codenamed Operation PIMLICO, had been planned in outline since 1978 by Gordievsky's case officer and by successive Cs, Sir Maurice Oldfield, Sir Arthur Franks, Sir Colin Figures. The actual pickup at a sign-posted lay-by outside Viborg involved a diversionary crying baby, a Mars bar handed to a KGB sniffer dog, and a Ford Sierra whose boot had been modified to defeat thermal imaging by lining it with metallized film. It was, in the judgment of Christopher Andrew, who wrote the Authorized History of MI5, the single most successful Cold War exfiltration ever conducted by any Western service. Gordievsky was debriefed at a safe house in the fort near Portsmouth for 18 months. His product identified 25 KGB officers operating under diplomatic cover from the Soviet embassy in Kensington Palace Gardens. Thatcher expelled them on September 12, 1985. The Soviets retaliated by expelling 25 British diplomats from Moscow, 6 of whom were declared SYS officers. The London station was rebuilt from scratch. The last 4 years of the Cold War, from the perspective of the JIC and of MI6, were dominated by the question of whether Gorbachev's reforms were genuine or tactical. Craddock, and after him Sir Roderick Braithwaite as ambassador in Moscow from 1988, argued that they were genuine. Others in the intelligence establishment, including elements in the Defence Intelligence Staff who had spent careers preparing for a Soviet armoured thrust across the North German plain, remained sceptical until very late. The Berlin Wall came down on November 9, 1989. In Whitehall, the Chiefs of Staff continued to plan for the possibility of Soviet military reaction in Eastern Europe until August 1991, when the failed coup against Gorbachev by Vice President Gennady Yanayev and Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov collapsed within 3 days. By December 1991, the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. The British nuclear deterrent, born from the sale of the Naney engine's civilian cousin Logic in 1946, continued patrolling. HMS Vanguard, laid down at Barrow in September 1986, replaced Resolution as the Trident carrying platform in 1994. The V-bombers were long gone. The Chieftains were being replaced by Challenger 2. The Brixmis mission had wound up in 1990. Klaus Fuchs died in East Berlin on January 28, 1988, a decorated citizen of the German Democratic Republic. Conon Molody had died in Moscow of a heart attack in 1970. Kim Philby died there in May 1988. Oleg Gordievsky received the Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George from the Queen at Buckingham Palace in October 2007. Britain had lost the technology race in 1946 and, over the following 45 years, had won something harder: the intelligence war. The engines that started it were, by 1991, museum pieces.